I'm Robert May, Professor Emeritus of History at Purdue University, and speaking to you on behalf of the Seward Museum of New York as April Fool's Day 2020 approaches at a time of national crisis. It seemed to me that at this point it would be helpful perhaps to look at a previous crisis point on April Fool's Day in American history, the first April Fool's Day of the Civil War, a month after Abraham Lincoln had become president, the first anti-slavery president in American history, the first Republican president in American history, and about 3 months or so since the process had begun by which the Confederacy had been formed. South Carolina had left the Union on December 20th, 1860, fearing that Lincoln would attack slavery in some way. And South Carolina was quickly followed by 6 other states. They formed the Confederacy in Montgomery, Alabama in February of 1861. And they pretty much controlled the entire Deep South, except for some federal installations that still held in the area, most particularly 2 federal forts, Fort Pickens in Pensacola, Florida's harbor, and Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. And as long as these forts stood under federal control, they were a threat to the Confederacy's claim to sovereignty over its own territory. And it was pretty clear by the time Lincoln took office that war was a definite possibility over these forts. His Secretary of State, William Seward, was very aware of this and in fact was trying to negotiate some kind of a settlement or a deal with the South so that war wouldn't result from the contrary claims of the Union and the Confederacy to the forts. Seward was trying to hope to buy some time for an ultimate settlement between the North and the South that might preserve the Union. And putting all that together, we come to April 1st, when Seward sent to Lincoln a truly remarkable memorandum of advice to the new president. Now, Seward gives Lincoln certain advice over domestic policy matters in his memorandum. These are about things like patronage, when Lincoln should make appointments decisions, and the like. But the most interesting part of Seward's advice had to do with the policy that he was most concerned with, foreign policy. And in it, he makes some rather extreme suggestions that amounted to pushing Lincoln toward war with a foreign power. Now, you need to understand that at the time he writes this memorandum, France, ruled by Napoleon III, an autocrat, was considering moving into Latin America and basically trying to colonize Mexico. And Napoleon had even bigger dreams. He dreamed of sort of making Latin America a kind of French cultural bastion. At any rate, the French, as did other European countries and European bankers and interests, had claims on Mexico at the time. Mexico had defaulted on debts to foreigners. And so Napoleon was rattling sabers about moving into Mexico. Spain had just re-annexed the Dominican Republic. Now, Spain had originally controlled the Dominican Republic as a colony. The Dominican Republic had achieved its independence. Now Spain, around the time Lincoln's taking office, is re-annexing the Dominican Republic as a colony. Britain still controls Canada on America's northern borders. And so you need to keep all this in the background, as well as the fact that back in 1823, decades earlier, President James Monroe had made a statement in his annual message to Congress that amounted to a warning to the European powers that although they could keep their colonies that they already had, for instance, Spain controlled Cuba at the time, and still did in the Civil War, that they could not move back into the Western Hemisphere and colonize or recolonize areas that had become independent in recent decades. So that's the backdrop. Seward tells Lincoln in his note, and I'm reading here from Roy Bassler's edition of Lincoln's correspondence and other documents. Seward says, I would demand from Spain and France categorically at once explanations. I left a word out. I would demand explanations from Spain and France categorically at once. In other words, why is France moving into Mexico or threatening Mexico? Why is Spain re-annexing the Dominican Republic? Tell us what you're doing. And there's an implicit warning of war there. It's making demands of those countries. Then he says, I would seek explanations from Great Britain and Russia and send agents into Canada, Mexico, and Central America to rouse a vigorous continental spirit of independence in this continent against European intervention. So what Seward's saying to Lincoln is basically let's rattle sabers ourselves over the Monroe Doctrine and sort of threaten war and try to cause a unified front throughout the Americas. And if satisfactory explanations are not received from Spain and France, I would convene Congress and declare war against them. So Seward's doing what rulers have done throughout history. If you've got problems domestically, create a foreign war. It'll take minds off the domestic problems and perhaps unite the country. And then he says, whatever policy we adopt, there must be an energetic prosecution of it. We don't just announce a policy. We really need to do it. And for this business, it must be somebody's business to pursue and direct it incessantly. Someone needs to be on top of this issue. And then he sort of suggests that the president might not have the time. He's got a lot on his mind, including running what might be a war effort eventually. And he's got a lot on his mind. And so he says either the president must do it himself and be the whole active in it, or he might devolve it or leave it up to a member of his cabinet to handle. So basically, Seward is implicitly saying that some member of the cabinet might be better suited to handle these important foreign policies, and then he all but says it might as well be me. He says, it is not in my special province, but I neither seek to evade nor assume responsibility for these policies. So Seward is basically saying to a newly elected president of the United States that the president, at least in the foreign policy realm, should abdicate responsibility and devolve the crisis onto a member of his cabinet. We're seeing these issues today with the coronavirus problem and whether or not Trump should have a czar and over the virus problem and that sort of thing. So that's what Seward is suggesting. And a very interesting thing happens after he sends this memo. Lincoln writes a response to it in which he basically says, I'm the president and I'll take advice from the cabinet, but the buck stops with me. He certainly doesn't turn the reins of policy completely over to Seward. But we don't know, for one thing, if he ever sent the memo back because it wound up in the Seward papers, or rather in the Lincoln papers rather than the Seward papers. And when it was discovered years later, that's where the memo was. And so if Lincoln had sent it, he wouldn't have filed it himself. It would have turned up later in the Seward papers, presumably. So we don't know what Lincoln did. Did he ever even mention it to Seward afterwards? Did he show by body language that he was in control? Did he bring it up at a cabinet meeting? How did Lincoln handle it? We don't really know. What's really interesting are two things: to contemplate why Seward sent the memo in the first place, and then to ruminate a little bit over the meaning of the whole incident. Well, I think it's pretty clear that Seward might have sent the memo in part because he genuinely felt he had more experience in foreign policy. He had more experience in public policy in general. He had been New York governor. He had been U.S. Senator from New York for multiple terms. He was known as an expert on foreign affairs. And in addition to that, he had traveled broadly overseas. Lincoln had not traveled overseas. He had only served a single term in Congress. He had not been a state's governor. And so Seward undoubtedly felt he was more qualified in the foreign policy realm. And in fact, he had expected to receive the Republican nomination for president in the United States and actually been ahead on the first ballot. So he undoubtedly felt he had more experience in foreign policy. Whether he sent the memo really hoping to take over or not is up in the air. Seward's own son, Frederick, said that these were just meant as policy recommendations, not as any kind of a power grab by Seward. So historians have been mulling over the incident ever since. It is a rather bizarre incident in which a Secretary of State basically tells the president, you might want to devolve the power on me. So that's one thing that happened in this April 1st crisis. The other thing is the non-event. Because Lincoln never made it a matter of dispute between him and Seward, or if he did, he managed to assuage Seward's feelings. The end result was that Seward stayed in the cabinet. There was no crisis between them. And over the coming months, really by the end of the year, they worked out an excellent working relationship, one of the most successful collaborations between a president and secretary of state in U.S. history. And so it's both a testament, I think, to Lincoln's ability to wisely consider personnel matters and policy matters as president, and the balance, insight, and thoughtfulness he brought to his decision making. But I think it's also testament to to Seward, that Seward didn't have such an ego that when he didn't get his way, and when Lincoln kept his fingers in the foreign policy pot, so to speak, and didn't create Seward as kind of a foreign policy czar, that Seward decided to hang in there and to work with Lincoln and to maintain cordial relations with the president that he undoubtedly felt had a lot to learn in the foreign policy realm. So on behalf of myself and the Seward House Museum in Auburn, New York, I hope this April Fool's message has given you something to think about.